Foster Power is a movement to improve the lives and futures of youth in Florida's foster care system by creating access to information on their benefits, protections, and legal rights. Foster Power is the first app of its kind nationwide and was made by lawyers with youth input. Visit fosterpower.org/app to download the free mobile app today.
Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of The Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at The Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. Check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web and at Safe Camp Audio on social media. This is episode 150 of the Imprint Weekly Podcast. Not bad for a little team of two here, and all credit for getting this out into the world week in and week out goes to my extremely talented and wonderful producer, Christina Joko, who, if you read the Imprint as well, should be doing, imprintnews.org, also does all of our amazing illustration work and a lot of the charts you see in our stories. So we owe her a ton. And of course, thanks to the dozens of young people, parents, advocates, lawyers, city, state, federal leaders, doulas, everybody who have generously given up their time to come on the Imprint Weekly Podcast for an interview. I'll do this every 50 episodes, so we'll do this again at the episode 200. So today for episode 150, we're joined by Dawn Post to talk about really one of the more interesting careers in child welfare that I'm aware of, probably far over since Dawn is not old, but she actually tried her first case in dependency court as a teenager, which I didn't know until this interview. And we talk about the Broken Adoptions Project she started up in New York City, which is way ahead of its time, right? That's something that's really coming to the forefront media-wise this year. Her work on reducing the use of congregate care and foster care, and her recent experiences in the realm of writing. Before we get to Dawn, let's hit some headlines for the week. Last week, we spent a lot of time talking about great coverage at the Imprint. Today, we'll focus in a little bit on two pretty major stories from other investigative outlets, and then some interesting Imprint stuff, don't worry. So the first one, published by ProPublica and The New Yorker, written by Eli Hager, comes out of Colorado and puts a broader context on a case that had actually already kind of been reported on pretty thoroughly by a local news affiliate there. So I'm going to drop both stories into the show notes. I'll describe the case in a nutshell and then get to some of the bigger picture that it gets fit into according to the ProPublica piece. So this story involves Alicia Johansson and Fred Thornton, who had a child named Carter in 2019. He was born exposed to meth and to THC and ended up in foster care upon release from the hospital. The couple had made steady progress towards the requirements placed on them in order to reunify with Carter. And, fast forward to the end here, they have regained custody of Carter, and per the story, they're living happily and healthily together. Is healthily a word? What happened in the middle is that Carter's foster parents, aided by a veteran lawyer named Tim Eyrich and an attachment expert named Diana Baird, tried to adopt Carter. A foster parent trying to adopt, that's not news, not a development. Certainly an issue of concern for some people. The extent to which foster parents are recruited on a foster to adopt basis as opposed to being recruited as a person whose job is going to be to support a family that is trying to get their child back. What's different here in this story and what Hager describes as an increasing practice in the United States is that the foster parents moved to intervene in a case to adopt this child, Carter, before the parents' rights had even been terminated. And in this case, while they were making, meaningful progress towards getting their kids back, nobody was really out there saying, this is a bunch of parents this is a group of parents that aren't doing anything. They're not responsive in court. They're missing visits, any of the usual stuff that might get a parent in hot water with the courts. This was a couple that was moving towards reunification, and a foster parent caring for their child intervening before the courts had even, taken up the issue of of terminating their parental rights. So in effect, the foster parents were seeking to get the rights of the parents terminated. Now, Hager notes that Eyrich was the lawyer who argued a state Supreme Court case in Colorado back in 2013 that really affirmed the rights of foster parents to do this in Colorado. That led to, after that Supreme Court made clear it is a proper under Colorado law to intervene, for foster parents to intervene, that led to a threefold increase in these cases kind of in the next 5-year window. And Hager notes that at least 15 states, I don't think it's listed out in full anywhere in the story, but he says at least 15 states now allow foster parents to directly file to terminate a biological parent's rights as if they were prosecutors. And he adds that list has grown. So he cites 15 states in total, but notes that there's 3 states, South Carolina, Florida, and Kentucky, that have all passed recent laws kind of in the last 5 years to, ease the path for either from foster care, or I guess in South Carolina, I think it was, basically enabling anybody in the state to kind of bring that sort of intervention. Now, to the side of that, one aspect of this story is actually quite similar in nature to the Fighting for Kin series that the imprint published last week. We talked to Sarah Tiano on the podcast about it last week. And that is the presence of attachment theory as kind of a starring role in, one of these pursuits by a foster parent, over in the Colorado case, a parent. In the case of the Minnesota series that I just referenced for the imprint, it was with kin. There's, growing skepticism, I would say, around the validity of attachment theory as this dominating presence in child dependency cases. And yet in both of these stories, the attachment of the child to the foster parent was, for a time at least, a winning argument against parents or against relatives. In one story, a high qualified aunt trying to adopt after the termination of rights in Minnesota. That's the one that we wrote about. And in Colorado, a set of parents moving towards reunification. Now, story 2 by Julie Lurie of Mother Jones is, I think, a very specific look at one piece of something larger that we mentioned a few months back on the podcast, and that is the use of psychiatric residential treatment facilities for foster youth, which after reading this story, I'm even more convinced is something maybe, the Biden administration or somebody should be looking into. The extent to which psychiatric residential treatment facilities, which are often just referred to in shorthand as PRTFs, are being used to house youth who are in foster care, and whether, if and whether there's a pretty significant expansion of, these facilities and space within them going on. So let's start with this story, which jumps in with the account of a girl who spent a good deal of her time as an adolescent at an Alaska PRTF called North Star, where she tells Lurie, the author, that they frequently use drugs to chemically restrain kids that they worry will act out. The facility is run by Universal Health Services, which is a massive for-profit company with hospitals and residential treatment centers around the world, including several youth-focused ones that are, essentially these psychiatric residential treatment facilities, or PRTFs. And what Lurie describes in this piece is a company that has come to rely on contracts with states to place foster youth in these settings as a very reliable stream of income. I believe one person doing some investigative research on this that talked to Lurie for the story basically said that foster youth are a gold mine for UHS. Lurie's research for her piece surfaced 38 states that provided data who sent foster children to UHS facilities more than 36,000 times. That's in a window between 2017 and 2022. And then she got 31 states that responded to Medicaid query information. And when you aggregated those responses from the 31 states, they spent more than $600 million on the treatment of foster children at UHS facilities over the same period, presumably through Medicaid, since that's where the source was. So it's that last part, Medicaid spending of more than $600 million at UHS for foster care, is what really raised my radar here, because of a finding from Child Trends' recent analysis of child welfare spending that we had talked about, I think, back in June on the podcast. And what that Child Trends analysis showed was the ascendance of Medicaid as a federal payer in child welfare. So I think most people that listen to this week in and week out know that kind of the big kahuna when it comes to federal funding of child welfare is the Title IV-E program. that has sort of historically been used to reimburse states for a lot of the cost of foster care, subsidizing adoptions. More recently, through the Family First Act, there's at least the offer of funding for services to prevent foster care, which most states have not really availed themselves of too much more. And then, the next two biggies have largely been temporary assistance for needy families, TANF, or social services block grants. So those are kind of like the three biggest ones, but 4E is the biggest one. Now, Medicaid, according to Child Trends analysis, and this was pegged to 2020 because they're a few years behind, it's, Medicaid's still below 4E, TANF, and social services, but it's up to just under $1 billion per year now in child welfare spending is through Medicaid. That's almost a 20% increase from 2014. So a little bit, at least, of the increase in Medicaid could probably be explained by the fact that during COVID, one of the kind of early, relief efforts from the federal government, I think in the first stimulus even, was to ratchet up the Medicaid match coming from the government. So the states were getting more on the dollar from the Medicaid program. But that does not come close to explaining the entire increase in why Medicaid has become so much more used as a financial vehicle for spending in child welfare. Here's what Child Trends had to say about it in their analysis. While the reason for the remainder of this increase, Medicaid I'm talking about, is not entirely clear, it's possible child welfare agencies are using Medicaid more frequently to cover the cost of institutional placements because of restrictions on Title 4E congregate care reimbursement and rules governing Medicaid reimbursement for services for children in certain congregate care settings. So just to translate that a little bit, I just mentioned the Family First Act, which opened up some new opportunities for federal funding for preventing foster care. That law also kind of put the clamps down a bit on federal funds to be used for congregate care, which is group settings, group homes, residential, facilities, things like that. It basically limited, the use of 4E for such placements to 2 weeks unless a state was using one of four pretty significant exceptions. One is called a Qualified Residential Treatment Program. That is, a newly created term where, programs would have to go get accredited as one, and then they could be kind of seen to be providing a more acute form of intervention or service to a youth who is very much in need of behavioral health. And we've had a few guests on the show to talk about some wariness about whether or not that whole process is actually yielding, specialized residential programs that are actually out there doing sort of a different level of care, or whether or not, in some states at least, a lot of programs are just kind of doing business as usual, and I don't want to say rubber stamp, but they got pretty easily accredited. And so, reading between the lines of the Child Trends analysis, I think what they're wondering is whether or not the fact that, the largest funding source for foster care payments making it harder to use for congregate care and institutional placements has, steered more states and local systems to thinking about what other ways can we find to pay to put youth in institutions, frankly. And, this explanation, what they're musing about here, is supported by, survey data that they do as part of their financing report, which is really great, by the way. I mean, they do a tremendous job in it. I'll link to it again. We did it in June as well. But in their 2020 analysis, the survey data indicated that Medicaid had become a top funding source for congregate care in quite a few states. And that explanation could really help explain the increase in Medicaid expenditures by child welfare agencies, although it is important, and this is their words here, it's important to consider this explanation as a hypothesis that requires more explanation. And I guess what I'm saying is this story made me think it does require some more examination and perhaps more of something that a government could compel other governments to do as opposed to simply just news reporting. So that sort of explains what we just described, explains why states would go looking for another payer or source to pay for congregate care if they were continuing to seek to use it at the level they were at. But it is a little surprising that it would be Medicaid they'd run to, because traditionally the rules around Medicaid forbid its use to pay for institutional settings. There's some notable caveats to that, but generally, unless a place has less than 16 beds, it really needs to be either a psychiatric hospital or a wing at a hospital, or and this is sort of where the story ties in, the other source that can draw Medicaid funding for placements of youth in foster care, or anybody, frankly, for Medicaid, is a psychiatric residential treatment facility, or a PRTF. So just to add a little bit more context or information, I referenced that the Child Trends Survey, along with their kind of financial analysis in the 2020 report, found that, several states identified for the first time really Medicaid as a top payer for congregate care. There were 12 of those states that did so. So 12 out of 50 states identified Medicaid as a top 3 payer for congregate care. I went, after reading the Child Trends analysis, and just sort of did a LexisNexis search to see, okay, what has been written about in terms of the use of these psychiatric residential treatment facilities, because that's not going to be all of the use of Medicaid to pay for congregate care. But, I think it's a reasonable assumption to say that dedicated facilities and programs for youth like these PRTFs are going to get the lion's share of those dollars, as opposed to like hospitals. Maybe I'm wrong there, but I didn't think so. So anyway, I went through, basically a year of coverage, 2023, to see, what I could find about local activity around PRTFs, the psychiatric residential treatment facilities. What I found was sort of 3 buckets that coverage. There was not a lot of writing about PRTFs, but the references broke it down sort of in this way. I found, 9 kind of unique articles. In some cases, I'm going to say, it's a lot of news stories, but with a healthy amount of opinion pieces put into this as well. So there were 9 pieces on building more space at PRTFs, either building new ones or expanding them. There were 8 pieces, and these were largely op-eds, kind of complaining about the lack of capacity, or identifying a lack of capacity and more need for psychiatric residential treatment facilities, at least one of which was written by a legislator. I found 6 that were, on problems at existing PRTFs, including several lawsuits. There are several states that are the subject of class action lawsuits, moving largely around the conditions that youth experience in PRTS. One is North Carolina, off the top of my head. I think Alabama is another. There might be more. And then I saw, 2 articles covering, the practice of sending youth out of state to psychiatric residential treatment facilities. So, largely what the media landscape would indicate there is that there is concurrently some completion of projects to expand psychiatric residential treatment space in America, in some of these states, some public pressure to expand the capacity and demonstrate the need for more capacity at psychiatric residential treatment facilities. And then at the same time, some coverage of the conditions that have led, in certain states, these PRTS to be the subject of lawsuits. So I guess the overall takeaway here, to try and tie all these random things I've spit at you in the last 5 minutes together, is that Medicaid as a payer of child welfare services is going up. It's going up by a lot in some states. It is at least in part due to the increased use of Medicaid to pay for congregate care settings, which should only be done in places like psychiatric residential treatment facilities, right? Medicaid should not be largely paying for your average group home or residential treatment center. You have another federal payer potentially for congregate care placements in Title IV-E, getting harder to use for that. You have companies like Universal Health Services, which is the focus of this Mother Jones piece, and nonprofit providers, all motivated to get youth into certain, beds at PRTFs. You have several states completing or in production of new space for PRTFs, as the LexisNexis search indicated. And you have several PRTF that are involved in these class action lawsuits over conditions, adding to that the pretty dismal picture painted of, these psychiatric centers run by UHS, by the subjects of the Mother Jones story. It's all, to me, when you step back and look at it, makes you wonder whether or not there is a, fairly quiet but dedicated increase in what would be, the most restrictive setting to put a youth in foster care in, and whether or not, the move towards that is motivated, at least in part, by the fact that paying for those with Medicare has become significantly easier in some ways than paying for other traditional congregate care type placements with the Title IV-E program. So something we'll be keeping our eye on, and I suspect that this story might get some more folks talking about that, maybe even up on Capitol Hill. All right, last one for this week. I want to recommend Imprint reporter Jeremy Loudenbeck's piece from last week that looks at an under-discussed issue in child welfare, and that is the practice of charging parents for child welfare services. So Jeremy spoke with a mother, Jacqueline Herrera, in Los Angeles. Social workers had argued that Herrera had failed to protect her children from a violent partner. As a result, the judge had ordered her to complete some parenting classes and months of counseling in order, in her case, to prevent her 4 children from going into foster care. So this was, family preservation work that was being mandated by the court. So Herrera achieved those goals. So she avoided, a family separation. But, and I'm kind of quoting from the story here, it weighed heavily on the mother, who had little help from her social worker as she rebuilt her life. Herrera said each week it cost $80 for family therapy, $40 for individual counseling, and an additional $60 for a babysitter. So Governor Gavin Newsom, California, signed a bill last week that will require dependency court judges, effective on January 1, 2024, to determine if parents can afford mandated service plans before the judge can actually order them. So that doesn't actually eliminate the possibility of fees, but it will prevent parents, from being penalized due to economic reasons alone. Or I guess the most accurate way to say it is a judge would actually have to take a look, determine that a parent could not afford the mandated services and still mandate them. I think that would put them in an awkward position. So it will have some, protective effect on judges, handing down just a laundry list of things that parents must do and foot the bill for at the same time. Juvenile court presiding judge Kemi Arakaki is among those who supported the effort. She called the financial burden on low-income parents in her courts the elephant in the room, and told Loudenbeck, if we could eliminate the wealth gap as a barrier to reunification, it could truly be a game changer for all of us. All right, when we come back, our interview with Dawn Post.
Today's Imprint Weekly podcast is brought to you by Accenture. Change is afoot in child welfare. Change that means agencies focus on results for children and keep far more of them safe at home with their own families. Accenture's child welfare team is leading the way in the effort to ensure technology does its part in that success story. Accenture offers cutting-edge case management tools that ensure agencies can see insights that drive decision-making, and caseworkers have information they need at their fingertips. Together, these tools help agencies stay laser-focused, reinventing child welfare into a source of strength for families when they need it. For more information, visit www.accenture.com/child-welfare.
All right, we are joined today by Dawn Post, lawyer, litigator, writer, teacher, but first and foremost, child welfare advocate, just to talk about a lot of things, a lot of her interesting career, what she's doing now, all the things. Dawn Post, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly podcast.
Thanks for having me. I very much appreciate it.
Always wanted to do this with you. I think it'd be a good conversation. Got to get the folks to know you first as a rule on our podcast before we get into serious stuff. Give us a favorite. Categories are book, movie, TV show, musical group, or sports team. You don't have to give me all those. You could give me more than one, but you got to give me one. Dawn is looking at me in terror because she isn't prepared for this. Don't worry. I'll cut out the silence as you think about it. But go ahead and give the guys some favorites.
So I would say music. I think that a lot of people may or may not be surprised at how much I listen to metal music. And so there's actually an amazing Mongolian metal band that I follow called The Hue.
The Hue?
Yes.
Okay.
Really fantastic show, but I have a very eclectic sense of music because that's what I grew up on without a TV. And my first favorite song was Hell is for Children by Pat Benatar, which was around the time that I was developing my desire to become an attorney for children. So I played that very, very loudly, which caused some concern in my household.
Yes. Tell me about young Dawn Post. I mean, I think I first kind of crossed paths with you as I was starting to cover what happens with adoptions when they fail, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But what early influences? How'd you get into this work?
I decided I was going to be a lawyer for children when I was 10 years old. And so I grew up in Maine.
How is that possible?
It is possible. And people don't believe it, but absolutely true. I used to start dressing in suits when I was 8 and definitely was recording my brother and labeling them as exhibits. But I grew up, we lived off the land. My parents were college graduates out of California and hitchhiked up to Maine and bought a piece of property and raised their kids there. And there was no TV, and I did a lot of reading. And so by 11, my favorite book was Ken Kesey, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And I did a lot of advanced reading, and there was a fatality that occurred in the state of Maine, in Auburn, Maine. A 4-year-old child by the name of Angela Palmer had been killed in a really horrific way, and trigger warning, very horrific.
Where are we, in the 80s now?
In the 80s. Yeah. So in 84, she had been put in an oven by her mother's boyfriend and burned to death. And so I obviously must have heard it through NPR or something like that. And I think she had recently been returned to her mother out of foster care. And in my mind, I was thinking, if she had a lawyer, then that might never have happened to her. Maine didn't have lawyers for children, so it's an unusual leap that I made into that. But I immediately decided I was going to become a lawyer for children and was very intent on getting there as fast as possible. So I dropped out of high school when I was 16 to go to college, worked at Pine Tree Legal Assistance by the time I was 18, and won my first case when I was 18.
Come on. Is this in Maine?
In Maine, because you could do administrative hearings as a paralegal. And, I looked and sounded older than I was, and definitely had a maturity about me. And I wasn't focused so much on academics, but the experience of working and impacting. And I remember vividly working with a 14-year-old on a domestic violence case, and I myself was only 4 years older than her. And
this is so wild. So you might be the answer to who is the youngest person to ever win a child welfare case.
I don't know.
And now there's people in foster care who are older than you were when you were working on the case.
So, so it was an amazing experience working for Pine Tree Legal. And then I actually went to law school here in Minnesota, because we're here at National Association and Council for Children, because at the time they had a specialty in children's law. Wasn't well developed, unfortunately, but I think it's much more developed now. But my path was always going this way. And then I ended up in New York City. And as most people, started at legal aid in the juvenile rights practice and went from there.
Like I mentioned earlier, I think the first time I interviewed you was over the Broken Adoptions Project, which is your second gig was at
Children's Law
Center.
Yes.
Okay. So tell people about this, because you guys were ahead of a thing that became much more of a focal point. I still think it's a total blind spot and all that, but it's huge. But what did you guys, what was the impetus? Tell people about the project.
So after I became an assistant attorney in charge in the Brooklyn office at Legal Aid, and then I went and became a borough director at the Children's Law Center, I sat in a lot of citywide meetings, all these advisory committees. And one particular advisory committee was to the administrative judge, and it was about adoptions. And of course, with ASFA, the pressure is all about how to get kids adopted faster. And I was the only person in these meetings saying, how do we do adoptions better? Because no one wanted to talk about that. It was all about the timelines, making sure you don't get penalties, and which I understand. But historically, working within family court, we would see kids come back all the time. And it could be through custody cases, it could be through delinquency cases, certainly PINS cases, and additional abuse and neglect cases, which were fairly rare, but did happen. And so the reality that we all knew about was that these kids were coming back, but no one wanted to talk about it. And it's, it not so secret, but this was an issue. And so I began developing a project where I focused on broken adoptions. In fact, chose the term broken because there's a lot of legal terms that are thrown around. Dissolution being one of them. Disrupted is another, but they can mean different things in different contexts.
Yeah.
You could be disrupted if you were in a pre-adoptive home and then removed. And so I settled on broken because if you call it a failure, then you're saying there's no way to change it.
Yeah, no, that's true.
And so this is, I think, a fixable issue. And so have kind of generally, as a catch-all, call it all broken adoptions when a youth is no longer living with their adoptive parent.
Yeah, and it's like so easy to tell that this is a place where the demand and interest for some support and help is like just not matched by what's out there. I remember, you telling me like we put feelers out, just kind of grassroots about this, and quickly just started hearing from tons of parents and tons of kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll never remember who it was, but I remember somebody organized a congressional briefing on this. This is like before I met you. I think I was still at Youth Today at the time. And this guy, he was from New York, so you probably crossed paths, said, we got the state to basically just like let us, like give us an address list to just say, hey, we're interested in helping people if they're having trouble with stability after adoption. Send us back, like this is a mailer, hit us back if that is. And it was just some absurdly high return rate on direct mail. Direct mail is like you might hear from 2%. He was like heard from like 15-20% of these people come back to us. Wow. That was the first time I remember being like, oh man, so this is like a real blind spot that we're not looking at. And you guys were first in on that. I mean, what you often hear a lot about parents and adoptive parents feeling like there's some issue they either can't afford or can't deal with themselves, and like this becoming something where they have to put a child into foster care to get the services they need. Did you find that to be a large portion of that, or it was not that?
Yeah, that definitely, I would say, is the minority of cases. And those are the ones that you see in the news. This family that's dealing with very high special needs with a youth that needs to be in a residential center, and their private insurance wouldn't pay for it. Yeah. And essentially they felt forced to return the child to care in order to get the help that they needed. I believe that that's by far such a minority of cases. Certainly was not seen in New York, where kids were on Medicaid and continued to receive Medicaid after they were adopted.
Right. So they could have gotten it. So like what were, I mean, you don't want to say what's the typical, cookie cutter case, but what were the kinds of situations that you guys would frequently see propelling kids back in?
So we ended up doing a 6-month study at the Children's Law Center, and it was literally just looking at every petition that came in, as well as I went into the file room and went through cases and looked at old cases to try to estimate that. And 75% of the cases that we looked at involved the death or infirmity of the adoptive parent. Now, that was very much because of the fact as well that the Children's Law Center dealt with custody, visitation, and order of protection cases primarily. And so abuse and neglect were the minority of cases there. So that would definitely skew the results. But death or infirmity of the adoptive parent, where someone else stepped in and applied for guardianship or custody of the youth, was quite common. Mm-hmm. And then what we noticed also out of that is that a number that often the behavior of the youth was cited as a contributory reason. But in actually diving into and digging into the issues, it appeared that this was normal adolescent behavior that was becoming pathologized. And you had older adoptive parents that were saying, I already went through this with my own kids, I don't want to deal with it again, or that they just didn't have the time or energy. And, I even had one adoptive mother who looked at a teenager who was begging to return home, and she said, no, you just have bad genes. So, it certainly calls into question, too, how we're assessing a level of commitment. But our finding was essentially that there was no unconditional commitment to these kids. And so behavior that normally would be acceptable within a biological family unit was just deemed unacceptable if it was an adopted child. And so they were very quick to return them to care or have someone else apply for custody or guardianship of them, or simply put them out. And so we worked with Covenant House, who did a study of their own as more interest around this grew. And they estimated, Covenant House New York, that they were seeing 120 youth who had been adopted and were now homeless because their adoptive parents had put them out. Lawyers for Children, another law firm in New York City, they did their own study and did a manual count. And 1/5 of their caseload was youth who had been returned to foster care under a voluntary placement agreement. That was 200 kids.
All after adoptions?
All after adoption. 200 clients out of 1,000 That's a significant number.
That's huge. Yeah.
That's a huge number. And these were situations that obviously ACS was familiar with because they did the contract to return the child to foster care. And they even dove even deeper to see how many were planning for the youth, or were they simply being abandoned in the system. Mm-hmm. And most, had no contact with their adoptive parent after they were placed back in care. This was also following the very famous Judith Leakin case, which was in, I believe, 2007. And she had been in Florida and collected $1.65 million in subsidies for 11 special needs children. And they were severely, severely neglected, and some were homeless in the state after she had moved to Florida.
Yeah, I'll drop a link to some reporting that was done on that case for people that want to read about it in the show notes. But it's just really called into question, what are we doing in terms of vetting people? Mm-hmm. But also, we're offering these generous subsidies to incentivize adoption for foster care. And I think that's one thing that you guys were also ahead of with the product and adoption, is really calling into question, that's fine as long as it's continuing. But
right.
What are we doing when these things disrupt? Are we still just paying people to essentially be?
Oh, absolutely. And that was something that I learned more as I dug into the research, and it's now something that I feel like I'm always screaming about into the void because no one seems to know about it or want to address it. The fact that adoption subsidies continue to get paid to adoptive parents, even if the child's no longer living with them. So in New York City, when you get paid until 21, because that's what the contract calls for, that's a lot of money going to youth where youth are homeless or living with someone else, or couch hopping, There's a variety of circumstances where that money could be used, yet is being collected and continuing to be collected by adoptive parents.
So, yeah, and not to assume that people know what we're talking about right now. I'll give a thumbnail. Not all adoption subsidies involve federal money, but most do.
Yes.
And that money comes with some conditions. And I think that's the part that's very hard to square the circle on, why it's become this morass, because there are very specific things that would trigger the end of subsidies. But if I'm working back off of memory of talking to you about this years ago, it's there's federal rules around it, but then it's not really anybody's job to go and check if it's.
And in fact, HHS and ACF, they have guidance that's been specifically issued to the state, because this is under the Social Security Act and it's considered an entitlement, that the government is not allowed to be that intrusive with adoptive parents. They don't want the department in whatever state going and saying, are you still caring for the child? How are you caring for the child? And
you just painted it perfectly. It's rules on when it would end, but you can't find out if those things have been.
Exactly. Yeah. And so in some states, they sue for child support, but it simply wasn't worth it, from a fiscal perspective. In New York City, where a lot of adoptive parents were on public assistance themselves, adoption subsidy is not considered an income, so it could not be calculated. And so then you'd end up with a minimal $25 a month in child support anyway. So there are a lot of states that don't even pursue child support because of that. But the subsidy can be quite a bit. In New York, it ranges from a little over $900 to almost $2,000 for exceptional circumstances. And this is another issue that we definitely saw in adoptions, where the behaviors of a youth were being exaggerated in order to get them on medications, in order to get higher rates. And then there's this abandonment after, when you should have known that this child had higher emotional needs or other, that you needed to monitor and be aware of and help take care of.
Yeah.
That's why you got a higher subsidy, but they're immediately put out when those behaviors start exhibiting.
Not a real surprise that Covenant House was an early canary in the coal mine, because I just feel aren't they really just nationwide? They are the dumping ground is pejorative to them. They are the receptacle for things that go wrong in child welfare.
Absolutely.
Failed adoption,
aging out youth.
Yeah, or kids that just, they don't get into extended care for whatever reason, and they're just parked there.
Absolutely. And literally my project I started with writing a law review article. Who reads law review articles, you would think. But We had, a lot of youth stories in there that made it very compelling, as well as a small study that we had done. And, I'm an attorney. I'm a difficult attorney, I would say.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I'm fairly hard in court. I'm certainly a very hard cross-examiner. So imagine going from a perspective where ACS and I were on very, opposing sides on many issues, and then ask for collaboration. And here are caseworkers that I might have made them, cause them to cry on the stand. And now I'm saying, let's team now on this issue around broken adoption. So it was a real shift for me in professional development and, trying to gain support around what I considered to be such a critical, important subject. And gain partnerships around that. And that took time. That was a lot of meetings. That was a lot of conversations and repeating myself. I'm not a very patient person, and I learned patience through that. But those conversations kept building. And, to this point, a decade later, I just have entered into a consulting contract with ACS to develop a training video that will focus a bit on how to prevent broken adoptions and help to educate pre-adoptive parents and agencies around these issues. So that's a huge step in that, we can have that collaboration that where a decade ago, no one even wanted to speak about it in these citywide meetings.
And I mean, you guys, again, were ahead on trying to give numbers. I think it was really what you guys did in New York. I think there were 2 one-off studies, if I'm remembering right. One was in San Diego and one in Illinois. Still no federal regular collection. It has been required of the feds through AFCAR since 2014 in the law there. But we've just been in a hamster wheel in terms of adding new data elements because, the Obama people put a rule out right on their way out the door. Then Trump froze it and now it's in litigation and who knows. I've heard that that's coming soon.
It should be coming. And I've asked various states if they've started modifying their systems to be able to upload that data point. And that's certainly not happening.
Yeah. That's the worst part of this is that I just remember when they finalized the Obama rules, it was in the rules that they'd have 2-3 years or more. And I just off of history repeating itself, I feel like whatever the result is here, they're going to give them that next 2 years. They're going to give them the 2 years again.
Yes.
Which means we've gone from 2014, it'll probably be 2026.
I have no
before
doubt.
we even get.
I'm proud of the fact that it got in there, and that was due to our advocacy in New York. We got support letters. Yeah. I think we had 26 support letters, including from OCFS and ACS, in support of adding broken adoptions to AFCARs. And so I consider a huge win that did occur. However, as you just stated, we're looking at a decade now where it's not actually been implemented. Not only that, data is only as good as what's uploaded and is only as good as the caseworker is putting it in. And so, oftentimes names change and there's so many different circumstances under which they might not even know that a youth was adopted. And so I think there's going to be a lot of lost data around this issue. And as long as no one's looking at it, it's just going to remain a hidden issue.
Yep. And then, so USA Today kind of recently stepped into this gap, and kudos to them. They did an amazing job really doing the Lord's work, mining what data is available. I think it made some waves. I think some people were maybe surprised by it. I doubt you were, but what were any of their numbers? And again, I will, for people that want to look, I'll put the links in as behind paywall, but I think you can get a free trial and check all that stuff out. I'm working off memory. I think it was 66,000 failed adoptions in a pretty tight window. So maybe 5 years.
I don't recall how many years it was. And certainly it was before the data point was even being considered for broken adoptions. But they did such an amazing deep dive and analysis of the AFCAR's data and their investigative team. And it really was a great piece. And one youth out of New York was highlighted in that piece. But definitely a must read, I think. And we're really great about identifying issues in child welfare. But trying to solve them is a totally different issue. And so this is one of those, hopefully it just doesn't, pass and no one really does anything about it. My hope is that more will continue to occur.
Same.
And one thing I wish they had been able to address in the series was definitely around adoption subsidies, and they didn't do that.
No.
And so I would love to see a national publication take that on.
I would as far as solutions go, I definitely came away from that series feeling like almost more optimistic that it's fixable. In that, I guess I don't think I realized the extent to which broken adoption was very, not to say this doesn't happen with younger kids. It is it's like when you just look at the big picture, it's not a huge percentage of the outcomes, like 2% of people that go into an adoption, fail by the numbers. I know It's probably a little more than that, but it's like much, much, much more likely if the kid is older.
Yes.
And it's much more likely if they are black childs or if they have, mental health. And if you bundle any two of those things, it's like super possible
Absolutely,
that would happen.
right.
But I don't know. There's just so many things in child welfare where you just look and it's like, man, this is so big. Like, is this fixable? I think the numbers they brought into kind of specific relief made me think that's a clear avenue to put the resources to if you just figure out what they are and what people need, and go after, particularly those cases with like older youth getting adopted.
Yeah. And certainly, post-adoption services would be,
right.
first thing off the top of our heads of what could help with these situations. And not every state is going to have, really robust systems.
Yeah.
And, there's a lot, I think, that can be done just around the initial decisions around deciding how attached the two individuals are.
Mm-hmm.
And we had actually made recommendations at one point to the courts about circumstances under which a judge might refer a pre-adoptive family for an evaluation to to make an assessment around commitment. And not only commitment, but around being able to take care of special needs. One of the criteria that we had suggested was that if there had been a psychiatric hospitalization in the year before, or if they had only been placed less than a year in the home, or if they had put in a 10-day notice and asked that the child be removed and then changed their minds, to really try to dig into attachment. Because, listen, the judges and the attorneys all turn to caseworkers to say, how great the attachment is. But very few caseworkers actually are social workers and are really trained around this. But they bandy that word about in the psychological sense.
Yeah.
And it's just accepted. And that, I think, we can do more digging around. Unfortunately, the recommendations never went anywhere in New York, the ones I just mentioned. But there are definitely circumstances under which, as a baby lawyer, I was involved in, where we're begging, pre-adoptive parents to keep the child because, again, everyone feels pressured to get the adoptions done as soon as possible.
Yeah.
And when we really need to maybe say, let's slow down and think about this and really assess it.
Are you a professional in the field of child welfare, juvenile justice, or other family and youth services? Subscribe today to Youth Services Insider, the imprint's exclusive section on all the insider news you need to stay in the know. Funding opportunities, major federal and state policy shifts, interviews with key leaders in the field. It's all available only for our Youth Services Insider subscribers. Sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription today by visiting imprintnews.org/subscribe. Our podcast listeners get 10% off their subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10. That's imprintnews.org/subscribe and get 10% off your subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10 today.
Post-adoption services is kind of just an ethereal concept.
Yes.
What are the must-haves in your experience? Like, what are the things that like, if you could just wave a magic wand and it was like mandatory to do X, Y, and Z, what are like the most critical things that need to happen?
Quality therapeutic interventions is a big one.
Yeah.
I refer to it as the Medicaid mills in terms of an evolving set of new mental health providers that are not necessarily providing really intensive or appropriate treatment. And so I think that intervention could be hugely helpful. But it's amazing around the country talking to people, how few people, they're so reliant on the agencies to solve their problems that, as a foster parent, The agency makes all the decisions. You turn to the agency when you need assistance. And how many people don't know what's available and may not have the tech skills or even be that familiar with the internet to, if they're an older adoptive parent, how many, just didn't even know who to call or who to access. And that's why it's important that even workers were not well trained around it. And we saw a lot of circumstances in the small study that we did where adoptive parents had come forward and asked for help, but rather than put in any help, they simply just replaced the child back into foster care. Really? And so that seemed really amazing to me because out of all the cases, because there's certain financial streams where therapeutic interventions could have been provided, but they weren't. And they were simply just brought back into care.
So it would be an adoptive parent coming there in search of help with communicating like, I don't want to.
Yes.
And that would be the solution to remove them.
Yes. Or, interestingly enough, we saw quite a few circumstances where they found a bio family member, and then the bio family member came in and filed for custody or guardianship. And so then they just circumvented bringing the child back into foster care by having someone file for custody or guardianship of the child. So that was another alternative. And this was a small study. I do want to emphasize that. And it was quite a while ago. But it was fascinating to see how many that out of all the cases where we saw adoptive parents ask for help, that it simply wasn't provided. And the quick solution was finding someone else to care for the child or bringing them back into care.
So after all this, I don't think I've ever really debriefed with you on this, but your next move was to get into litigation. Like you're in the weeds with these kids, which I'm sure probably is more fun. But you moved to A Better Childhood, which is, there's a couple of organizations around the country that really specialize in doing class action lawsuit over various aspects of child welfare and all kinds of things, but particularly conditions of foster care. Right. Safe to say that's kind of the core of the work. How was that experience? I mean, you did it for how many years? 5?
No, I did it for 3 years. Yeah. And it was, as I rose up in the work in New York City and was director of an office and supervised many people and trained many people around all of this, I really, it's hard to feel the wins in child welfare. And also, how do you even define a win? Mm-hmm. But you're constantly feeling like you're beating your head against a brick wall, and each individual success story is small. And as I was doing the broken adoption work and looking at things on more global level and becoming more interested in how can we create systemic change? And that's what I was trying to do with the broken adoption work, which led into the post-adoption sibling visitation work. And so I had envisioned that with class action litigation, that this was another being able to reform on a much bigger scale and see systemic improvement on a much bigger scale, which is really where my interest was at that time. And so it certainly was interesting to travel around the country and talk to child welfare practitioners and learn about the issues in their various states. And I was the lead in terms of bringing a case in Oregon and in West Virginia.
Oh, so that was your kind of role there, was to feasibility,
that was part of it, yes.
Situation for
exactly, because you want to look under the circumstances, and that also includes looking at the politics of that particular state as well, and the appetite for such a case as well.
I think people would be interested in this checklist. So what are you kicking the tires on to decide whether first, is there stuff to be litigated? And
yes. Because you could almost say that every state there's stuff to be litigated. Probably. What state is doing really well on everything? Yeah. Probably no one. But some states are performing better. Even just looking at the Child Welfare Gateway or, following the imprint, your publication in terms of, what stories are we seeing over and over and over again? One thing that caught my attention out of Oregon was their hoteling case, and that they were having so many kids in hotels. And I was exposed to things in investigations that I had never even thought about, like kids being placed in homeless shelters, or kids being placed in detention facilities, even though they were clearly a foster child. And so when you start really digging and interviewing people in a state, it was amazing how much information you do glean, but certainly understanding the politics of the certain situation in terms of have they worked on this issue before? Are they making a good faith effort to try to work on these issues? Is it something that they're willing to have a conversation about? There's a variety of things to look at, and also very data driven in terms of trying to find the data of what's happening in that state. And there was a lot of data in Oregon.
Something I've always wondered is like, is your assessment of a state's willingness to settle go in like the yes column or the no column? You know what I mean? Like,
I never, and I'm only speaking for myself, but I never looked at whether or not we thought a state would be willing to settle or not.
Right. Which they often do.
They often do.
More than not. I mean, Texas.
Well, Texas was heavily litigated and, is not going to stop litigating, I think, anytime soon.
Yes, because the judge basically said that at the last hearing. Yes. She said, you're going to be in this forever, basically.
And I think Judge Jack is prepared to be in it forever with them. I mean, she has taken this on as her cause.
Or do something. I mean, I don't know. We could see some outside the box stuff coming. I felt like that was a shot across the bow.
It very well could be.
We're back here with the same information next time.
Yes. And, unfortunately, also, you're not every system is going to have a judge like that who has become invested and really wants to see the system change and is holding them accountable. And this was part of the reason why I left A Better Childhood as well, is just, the frustration. Federal court is a different animal than state court. Mm-hmm. And the urgency that I felt around working with youth, and I was interviewing youth in these states who were in very desperate circumstances and bad conditions. And, that same sense of urgency is not felt in court. And things just go on for months and years and without any type of resolution. So that was very frustrating to me on a personal level, having to wait so long even to get like a decision on a motion to dismiss, for example, 2 years in. And, when these children are in desperate circumstance and need help now. And that's partly why I left as well, because I could be more impactful, I thought, in a different capacity.
Did the experience of working there change the way you felt about the strategy of class action? I think there is a reasoned debate about, do you lean on this too quickly? Do these work? I mean, there's, you see these class action settlements that go on for decades. And I think that what I ultimately ended up seeing was that it can bring a lot of attention to the system and to the issues, and a lot of positive attention in terms of from the general public, because anyone who works in the system is going to know the issues in the system. And so having that external pressure from the public or from the legislature can make a huge, huge difference in terms of having positive impact on the system. And so the cases can definitely bring a lot of great attention in that way and highlight a variety of issues. But it's also like a whack-a-mole. Like, for example, you see that kids are being hoteled. So if you solve that issue, what's going to happen? What Oregon did was then send the kids out of state to big residential facilities. And so, you may fix one issue, but it creates a totally different issue. And so that's a very complex, interrelated system in terms of having a positive impact. And also, most states just don't want to be monitored for that long and have independent data metrics that they have to meet that they didn't agree to. And so in the end, I wasn't as sure in how effective those class action lawsuits ultimately are, because we certainly have seen circumstances where there's been a withdrawal in terms of the case and involvement, and the system is, having just as many issues, albeit maybe different issues than what it started with. I can see why, for somebody who had an experience of being able to actually at least try to remedy a kid's situation in the moment and get them to a better place.
Yes.
Yeah, playing the long game with the feds, man.
The long game was not for me. And also, particular minds around constitutional law, and it takes a particular breed, I think, to be able to do that. But I very much enjoyed being an attorney for children. There's a lot of burnout related to that, and compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma as well, which it needs to be recognized and better understood. But having more control over being able to assist, I think was definitely a must for me in trying to move out of that field.
Yeah. So tell folks what you're up to now.
So I actually began writing a book, and then partly this was born out of the fact that in, the last 5 to 7 years, I had been working more on creative nonfiction, including my own life, and really writing about some parts of it. And there's so many, everyone wants to hear the success stories. What are all the books that are out there? The child that was homeless and eating out of a garbage can that entered foster care and is now highly successful. That's where an appetite is. Yet there are so many youth that are surviving and are such great kids. And I had a couple that had died, and it really struck me. I'm like, I'm the only one that holds their memory. And that felt very sad to me, but also just how to share to the general public, like, these are the realities of the situation. It's not the white picket fence that you think it might be. Yeah. It's not the savior, the white savior complex in terms of, we've saved these kids. It's they're really wanting to share the realities of it, and that, how you define success is not necessarily how I might define success in child welfare. And the fact that they survived it is simply a success, in many ways. So I started writing a book and querying agents. And what I heard back from agents was that the material was too dark, too harrowing. And so, again, they wanted a lighter type of book.
It's interesting because, there seems to be an appetite, at least in the academic publishers, for those types of books from, I don't want to say the parent side, but accounts of that experience.
Yes.
But there's not, when it comes to kids, you don't want to. Yeah.
And they are dark stories. They're hard to read. It's hard to listen to as well. But that's the reality of our work every single day. Mm-hmm. And I wish that more in the general public understood it better. And so, I've changed my query a little bit, and we'll focus it a little bit differently as I move on to other agents. But that's where I began and starting doing more writing. And I love teaching. And so I've been able to do more teaching and working for myself and being able to accept what cases that I want, and being able to, I'm actually considering pursuing my doctorate now and really digging more into broken adoptions and data analysis, and getting actually trained on it, since I called myself a pretend researcher when I did this 10 years ago. So I'm exploring many different things, and partly I think it's because I so early decided what I was going to do, and then I was driven to do that, and I'd been working since I was 13. And so I had this opportunity now to explore various other things. And ultimately, all of it is to try to improve and better the child welfare system.
One thing I know that you're passionate about that's very tied in, as the USA Today stuff service, to broken adoptions is congregate care.
Yes.
What they found in this series was, particularly for the older youth, when their adoptions disrupt, they often find themselves in a residential care or a group home or something like that. I wasn't at your panel because I knew I could make you talk about it on a podcast, but I was very interested. I had not thought of the interstate compacts, which will definitely not take the 15 minutes to go and explain. But the interstate compact on the placement of children I think you guys were talking about how you could use that to improve or at least stem the use of congregate care. Yeah, can you flesh that out?
Absolutely. So I became interested in big residential through in my investigations, doing class action work. But
did you coin that?
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of names like troubled teen industries really serve you.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what people think of when they think of residential. It's the wilderness camps from the 90s and, the troubled teen industry of the, out of control white middle upper class girl being taken to correct her behaviors to one of these wilderness camps. Mm-hmm. And so I was really surprised to see how they were being utilized by child welfare systems. And frankly, I call it predatory. You have really big umbrella organizations like Sequel or Acadia or UHS or Devereaux. There are quite a few. And we have recordings of them saying it's all about profit. The behavioral health industry, it's about making money. And they're making a lot of money from the child welfare system. And they're able to do this because there's a lack of placement array in most states. We're seeing a lot of issues in terms of not being able to place children anywhere. But the alternative should not be institutional care. And it was being really overutilized with very young children and not well monitored. which is why I initially became very interested in it. And I ended up connecting with, because the only people that were talking about it were advocates from the troubled teen industry. Paris Hilton has become the face of this. And in some ways, I feel very uncomfortable with that because she's not representative of, the kids that are there necessarily, because there are so many youth of color, broken adoption youth, SGM youth, sexual gender minority youth who are being placed in these institutions. And so I really have wanted to shine a spotlight on it. And so it occurred to me that no one is looking at ICPC and how to use it. So we all know that the bureaucratic red tape of the ICPC is a nightmare. And placing a child across state lines in a home, it takes an incredibly long period of time. So how are these states able to place a child within a week of putting in an ICPC application? And that's because they're just doing blanket letters and submitting acceptance letters on behalf of that child. So there's no actual investigation of the placement. There's no actual investigation as it pertains to that particular child to say, is this the best match? And so that's
you're
where,
saying like a child lawyer, that would be a right place to say, I want the court to to look at this.
Yes. Let's actually look at what the report says, or demand an independent assessment investigation of this facility, and that it's the best match for this particular child's needs, because that should be part of the ICPC process.
Yeah.
And so, and it can be, are they digging into the licensing records? How many times have abuse and neglect charges abuse allegations been called in that had to be investigated? What kind of violations have they had? How many penalties have they accrued?
Yeah.
Lots of questions to ask, because there's just this, all right, we have nowhere else to place them in the state. This looks like a beautiful campus. And they are, often look amazing. Where Cornelius Frederick died, that was a old boarding facility. And so was a beautiful, beautiful campus. But and there's a NASDAQ assessment that was provided on one of these companies that specifically talked about how having less well-trained, staff and being able to pay them less was more important in terms of profit margin than actually taking care of that child's needs.
I'll ride for Paris Hilton for a minute. Not any response to this. Really, to me, there's really two issues. It's congregate care is two issues as far as child welfare goes.
Right.
One is the use of it at all,
right,
which is very specific to child welfare, right? Like when parents go and pay a lot of money to put their kid into a wilderness camp, that's a supply dictated just by their willingness to do it.
Right.
And then there's the conditions in them.
Yes.
And I think it is actually kind of an interesting moment, because I remember covering in like the 2000s, George Miller, who's a representative from California, really had a bug up his ass about the wilderness side and like the private stuff, and we ought to be regulating them. And at the time, there wasn't really a lot of oxygen or interest, I don't recall, about like regulating congregate care and child welfare. And I feel like purely in the interest of trying to get any sort of like coherent rules around what is the bare minimum expectation of what it looks like in here, who's working in there, how safe it is, and all that stuff. I think it might be beneficial that it seems to have united. Like she is out there, but she's out there with people like think of us and people like that, basically saying like it really doesn't matter whether you're a rich kid in here or a poor kid from foster care. There's just certain things that we should be doing to me. And then on the child welfare side, and also like you're putting us in here sometimes for things that we like shouldn't be.
Right.
So we'll see where it goes. I mean, I don't know. They have that bill. That bill is like a very starter bill to me. But
it is very much a starter bill. It's the Stop Institutional Child Abuse Act, SICA. But also what happened this week, right before we did the presentation on big residential, was that my colleagues were at the delegates meeting for the American Bar Association in Denver, and there was a resolution passed, I believe it was Resolution 605, about, and it was unanimous, that they are going to, help support and address systematic abuse that is occurring within the institutional settings. I should also point out that big residentials I'm talking about are the for-profit industry when I'm talking about Sequel and Acadia and that type of thing.
Sure.
But they saw, I think I've heard it referred to as the Medicaid race in terms of accessing as many dollars as fast as they can and competing for that. But there's a lot of money to be made in behavioral health, and they figured that out. They've called it their secret sauce.
Have you encountered a congregate care space, or particularly like a residential treatment center, that you were particularly impressed with, that's in your head is like, if it looked like this, I'd be more comfortable?
No, I think maybe because I just approach everything from such a place of skepticism. It's not going to be as good as they say it is. And mostly I'm accepting of things that I'm hearing from the youth themselves. And so, looking way past the surface to be able to dive deep into what's actually occurring. And most people are not going to have that opportunity to do that. I was able to do that. And so, but no, not off the top of my head would I be able to identify one that I might like compared to others.
Gotcha. All right. Well, we'll have Dawn back when she gets her book published. When she gets her first, she's got to write it. Then she'll get it published, and then we'll have her back on to talk about it. But Dawn Post, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to Dawn Post for joining me today, and thanks to Foster Power, a movement to improve the lives and futures of youth in foster care by creating access to information on their benefits, protections, and legal rights, for sponsoring this episode of the Imprint Weekly Podcast. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at safecampaudio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you'd consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. And you can always email us at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.